Welcome. Before we step into one of the most unsettling mysteries of the 19th century, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Stories like this take deep digging through forgotten records, eyewitness accounts, and historical fragments to separate myth from truth. Tonight's story isn't folklore, it's the chilling case of Moses Grant, a black boy in 1851 whose words terrified entire communities because he claimed to speak with the dead, and sometimes the dead answered back. Moses Grant was born in 1851 in a small rural community where life was already shaped by hardship, fear, and silence. Records of his birth were sparse, barely more than a line in a plantation ledger. Yet from the very beginning, people said there was something different about him. He was described as a quiet child, unusually alert, with eyes that seemed to linger too long on empty corners of rooms. Even as an infant, Moses rarely cried. When he did, it wasn't the frantic wailing expected of a baby, but a low, steady sound that unsettled those who heard it. The women who cared for him whispered that he watched more than he slept, his gaze tracking movements no one else could see. As Moses grew, the differences became harder to ignore. Other children laughed, ran, and played loudly in the dirt, but Moses preferred to sit alone, often staring at places that appeared completely empty. He would tilt his head as if listening, sometimes nodding faintly, sometimes frowning in concentration. Adults initially brushed it off as imagination or shyness, but there were moments that made even the most skeptical uneasy. He would respond to questions no one had asked out loud, answering softly, as if continuing a conversation already in progress. When scolded for speaking out of turn, Moses would simply say, "They were asking me." When pressed on who they were, he grew quiet and refused to explain. By the age of 6, strange patterns began to emerge. Moses seemed to know things he should not have known. He spoke names of people long dead, referring to them as if they were still present. Once, while sitting near an old oak tree, he mentioned a woman crying there every night. Elders later recalled that a woman had indeed been buried nearby years earlier, her grave unmarked and long forgotten. Moses had never been told this. When asked how he knew, he replied with unsettling calm, "She told me." Those closest to him noticed that Moses avoided certain places entirely, refusing to cross thresholds or paths where others felt nothing at all. At the same time, he gravitated toward graveyards and abandoned structures, sitting quietly for hours as if waiting. When called back, he often protested, saying he wasn't finished listening yet. His voice carried no fear when he said this, only patience. To him, whatever he heard seemed normal, even familiar. What frightened people most was not that Moses spoke of the dead, but that he spoke to them. He did not describe ghosts as shadows or monsters, but as people with stories, regrets, and questions. He would sometimes relay messages without understanding their weight. Once, he told a grieving man that his brother was no longer angry, and asked him to forgive himself. The man broke down in tears, insisting no one knew about the argument they'd had the night before the brother died. Moses stood nearby, confused by the reaction, saying only, "He said you'd understand." Doctors were consulted, though their knowledge offered no comfort. Some claimed the boy suffered from delusions or heightened imagination. Others suspected epilepsy, hysteria, or a nervous condition, but no physical symptoms ever followed. Moses did not convulse, faint, or hallucinate in ways medicine recognized. He was healthy, sharp-minded, and calm, too calm. Many said, for a child carrying such visions. Ministers prayed over him, urging the voices to leave. Moses listened politely, then later remarked that the voices had laughed, not in mockery, but in sadness. Despite the fear growing around him, Moses himself never seemed disturbed by his abilities. He spoke of the dead as neighbors, not threats. To him, the boundary between life and death appeared thin and unremarkable, something others simply failed to notice. This frightened adults more than screams or hysteria ever could. A child who saw the dead as ordinary suggested something deeply wrong, not with him, but with the world they believed they understood. As whispers spread, Moses became isolated. Children were told not to play with him. Adults lowered their voices when he passed. Yet even then, people continued to seek him out in secret. Grief overpowered fear. Those who had lost loved ones wanted answers, closure, reassurance. Moses would listen, eyes focused on something just over their shoulders, then speak words that felt too precise to be chance. He never demanded attention or praise. He only repeated what he claimed was given to him. By the time Moses reached his early teens, the community was divided. Some believed he was touched by God, a messenger meant to bridge worlds. Others believed the opposite, that no human should hear the dead, and that such knowledge came at a terrible cost. Moses himself seemed unaware of either belief. He remained quiet, observant, burdened not by fear, but by the growing realization that what felt natural to him terrified everyone else. And in that silence, the foundation was laid for a mystery that science, faith, and history would never be able to fully explain. The moment that changed how people viewed Moses' grant came quietly, without drama, and that made it even more disturbing. It happened on a humid evening when a neighbor named Thomas Hale died suddenly in his sleep. Hale was a well-known man in the area, respected, and his death shocked the entire community. By morning, people gathered outside his home in disbelief. Moses, who had never been close to the man, stood among the crowd, unusually tense. He stared at the house with a fixed expression, his lips moving as if counting or whispering under his breath. When someone asked what was wrong, Moses replied, almost absently, "He's confused. He doesn't know why no one can hear him." The adults brushed it off as a child repeating what he'd overheard. But then Moses said something that made the room fall silent. He described the inside of the house in detail. The position of the chair near the window, the cracked plate on the table, the old boots left by the door. Then he said, "He keeps touching his chest. He says it hurt before the dark came." None of this had been spoken aloud. Hale's family hadn't yet told anyone how he died or what the room looked like. When the family finally allowed people inside later that day, everything Moses described was exactly as he had said. That alone unsettled people, but what came next shook them deeply. Moses asked to speak to Hale's wife. When she approached, trembling and exhausted from grief, Moses looked past her shoulder and said, "He says he didn't mean to leave things like that." Confused, she asked what he meant. Moses lowered his voice and repeated, "The letter in the coat. He never finished it. He says you'll think he didn't care." The woman collapsed into tears. Hidden inside Hale's coat pocket was an unfinished letter meant for her, something no one else knew about. From that moment on, people began to watch Moses differently. It wasn't just that he knew things. It was how he knew them, calmly. Without effort, as if he were simply repeating information given to him. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't seek attention. He spoke with the same tone one might use to describe the weather. That calmness frightened people more than hysteria ever could. Soon after, another incident occurred. An elderly woman passed away in a nearby settlement, someone Moses had never met. While sitting outside, Moses suddenly looked up and said, "She wants her ring buried with her. It's not on her hand." When word reached the woman's family, they were stunned. The ring Moses described, a thin gold band with a small crack, had been removed earlier and placed in a drawer, forgotten in the chaos. The family quietly returned it to the woman's hand before burial, shaken by how a child miles away could know such a detail. As these incidents stacked up, people began to test Moses, though never openly. They would ask vague questions or mention names of the dead casually, watching his reactions. Moses would sometimes respond instantly, other times fall silent, as if listening. When he spoke, his words carried information no rumor could explain, arguments that had happened behind closed doors, promises broken in secret, regrets never spoken aloud. He once told a man, "Your father says you were too hard on yourself. He knew you tried." The man later admitted that guilt had haunted him for years, something he had never shared with anyone. Doctors were called again, but this time they stayed longer. They observed Moses closely, asking him to describe what he experienced. Moses explained it simply. He said the dead spoke differently than the living, not with mouths, but with thoughts that felt heavy, like memories pressed into his head. He said some voices were loud and urgent, others soft and tired. Some didn't know they were dead at all. When asked how he could tell the difference, Moses answered, "They don't breathe, and they don't feel time." The doctors had no response to that. Clergy were less restrained. Some believed Moses was chosen, gifted with second sight. Others believed he was dangerously open to forces no human should hear. One minister demanded Moses repeat what the voices said during prayer. Moses listened, then quietly stated, "They're asking why you don't hear them anymore." The minister ended the session immediately and never returned. What made everything worse was that Moses could not turn it off. He didn't summon the dead, they came to him. At funerals, he would sometimes tremble, overwhelmed, clutching his head as if too many voices were speaking at once. He asked once if the dead could be told to wait their turn. That single question chilled everyone who heard it. The community began to fear that Moses wasn't just hearing the dead, that he was becoming a doorway. People avoided speaking near him, afraid their deceased loved ones might be listening too. Some blamed him for reopening wounds that grief had begun to close. Others secretly relied on him, seeking comfort no living person could give. Moses himself grew quieter, burdened by knowledge he never asked for and could not escape. It was no longer a question of imagination or coincidence. The accuracy, consistency, and emotional precision of what Moses revealed shattered every explanation people tried to cling to. Science failed to label it. Faith failed to control it. And with each confirmed detail spoken from beyond the grave, one truth became unavoidable. Moses Grant was hearing something real, something impossible. And once that door had opened, there was no closing it again. As time passed, the fear surrounding Moses Grant deepened, not just because he spoke with the dead, but because some of the dead seemed to speak before they arrived. This was the point where curiosity turned into dread. The first incident happened quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Moses was sitting outside one afternoon, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, when he suddenly stopped and looked up. His face went pale, his body stiffened, and he whispered, "He's coming, but he doesn't know it yet." An elder nearby asked who he meant. Moses didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he said a name, Jacob Turner, a healthy man with no known illness. People laughed nervously and dismissed it as nonsense. Jacob Turner was alive, strong, and working in the fields that very day. That night, Jacob Turner collapsed without warning and died before sunrise. The cause was never determined. When word spread, the laughter vanished. Those who had heard Moses speak felt a cold weight settle in their chests. Moses, when confronted, looked confused by their fear. He said simply, "He told me goodbye earlier. He didn't want to scare anyone." That was the first time people realized Moses wasn't just hearing the dead. He was hearing them day ahead of time. After that, similar moments followed, each one darker than the last. Moses would grow distant, distracted, sometimes refusing to eat. When asked what was wrong, he would say things like, "Too many voices today," or "Someone is getting closer." At first, people tried to avoid asking questions, hoping ignorance might protect them. But death kept answering anyway. A woman fell ill suddenly after Moses mentioned. A tired voice that couldn't hold on much longer. A young man drowned days after Moses warned that someone was afraid of water but couldn't escape it. None of these deaths were violent in a visible way. They were sudden, quiet, and final, just like the warnings Moses gave. What terrified the community most was Moses's accuracy. He didn't just predict death, he described how it felt to those about to die. He once told a man, "Your mother says the pain stopped before the fear did." The man froze. His mother was still alive at the time, bedridden but conscious. She died that same night, and before passing, she reportedly told her family, "It doesn't hurt anymore." When they connected the words, grief turned into horror. Doctors tried to intervene, insisting Moses was observing patterns or making lucky guesses. But Moses would sometimes predict deaths where no pattern existed. He once warned of a child who would die without sickness or injury. Days later, a young boy was found lifeless in his sleep, his body peaceful, as if he had simply stopped breathing. No illness, no marks. Moses said afterward, he didn't know how to stay. Clergy reacted strongly. Some believed Moses was receiving divine visions. Others accused him of inviting death by speaking it aloud. One minister confronted him harshly, demanding to know why God would reveal such things to a child. Moses answered quietly, "They don't come from God. They come from being lost." That answer spread faster than any rumor and unsettled even the faithful. People began to fear Moses' presence before any illness or accident. If he lingered near someone too long, whispers followed. If he looked at someone strangely, neighbors took notice. Some accused him of causing the deaths, though there was no evidence, only terror looking for someone to blame. Moses was forbidden from attending certain gatherings. Parents pulled their children away from him. Yet when death approached their homes, many still sought him out in secret, desperate for answers, forgiveness, or closure before it was too late. The weight of this knowledge changed Moses. He became thinner, quieter, burdened by things no child should carry. He once asked an adult, "If I don't say it, will it stop?" No one had an answer. Sometimes he tried to stay silent, covering his ears, rocking slightly as if the voices pressed too hard. But silence didn't save anyone. The deaths came whether he spoke or not. Eventually, people noticed another unsettling detail. Moses never predicted his own death. When asked about it, he said, "They don't talk to me about that." That frightened people more than any prophecy. It suggested limits, rules, and a structure behind what he experienced, something organized, intentional, and far beyond coincidence. By the time Moses reached his mid-teens, the community no longer questioned whether his warnings were real. They questioned why they were happening at all. Science offered no explanation. Faith offered no protection. And Moses stood at the center of it all, not as a villain or a prophet, but as a witness to a truth no one was prepared to face. That death did not always arrive silently, and sometimes it announced itself through a boy who never asked to listen. As the fear surrounding Moses' grant intensified, the people who believed most strongly in order and explanation stepped forward. Doctors and clergy, men trained to define the unknown and force meaning onto chaos. They came with books, instruments, prayers, and certainty, convinced that whatever was happening to the boy could be named, classified, and controlled. What they encountered instead was something that unraveled both science and faith at the same time. The first doctors to examine Moses approached him as a medical curiosity. They measured his pulse, tested his reflexes, checked his eyes, his hearing, his speech. They asked about headaches, seizures, fevers, anything that might explain hallucinations or delusions. Moses answered politely, patiently, often with unsettling clarity. He described the voices not as sounds in his ears, but as thoughts that arrived fully formed, heavy with memory and emotion. He said they came whether he wanted them or not, and that trying to ignore them made his chest hurt, as if he were holding his breath for too long. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. There was no fever, no tremor, no sign of madness they recognized. One wrote privately that the boy was disturbingly lucid. They tried controlled observation. Moses was kept away from funerals, from grieving families, from news of illness or death. They believed isolation would starve the phenomenon. It didn't. Moses still spoke of people dying miles away, people whose names he had never heard spoken aloud. When confronted with these failures, one physician suggested the boy possessed an extraordinary sensitivity to cues others missed, a theory that collapsed when Moses described deaths that had not yet occurred. Another proposed hysteria, but Moses displayed none of the emotional volatility associated with it. He did not panic. He did not seek attention. He did not benefit from what he knew. If anything, the knowledge weighed him down. The clergy arrived with a different certainty. Where doctors searched for symptoms, ministers searched for sin or blessing. Some believed Moses was chosen, touched by God to serve as a messenger between worlds. They quoted scripture about prophets and visions, about the veil between life and death thinning for the faithful. Others were less charitable. They warned that no human should hear the dead, that such knowledge invited corruption. They prayed over Moses, anointed his head with oil, commanded the voices to depart. Moses listened quietly, then said the voices were still there, confused, asking why the prayers were louder than the truth. One minister attempted a test. He asked Moses to sit in silence while scripture was read aloud, believing the word would overpower whatever held the boy. Moses closed his eyes. Halfway through the reading, he interrupted softly and said, "They're saying they recognize these words, but not your voice." The room went cold. The minister slammed the Bible shut and ended the session, later insisting Moses was mocking God. Yet those present noticed Moses looked frightened, not defiant. As these efforts failed, tension grew between science and faith, each accusing the other of mishandling the boy. Doctors warned that religious pressure could worsen a fragile mind. Clergy accused physicians of arrogance, of trying to cage the spiritual with instruments and ink. Moses stood between them, silent, shrinking, absorbing blame from both sides. When asked which explanation he believed, he said simply, "They don't belong to either of you." What unsettled both camps most was consistency. Moses' experiences did not change based on who examined him. He did not perform better under belief or worse under skepticism. He was the same in prayer as he was under observation, quiet, precise, exhausted. He once told a doctor that the voices did not care what people believed about them. "They only care if someone listens," he said. That sentence appeared in no medical report, but it circulated in whispers for years. Attempts were made to suppress the phenomenon. Moses was forbidden from speaking about what he heard. When he broke the rule, he was punished, not harshly, but firmly, as one might discipline a child for lying. Moses accepted the punishment without protest, but afterward, deaths continued, now without warning. Grief returned without explanation. People began to realize that silencing Moses did not silence what spoke through him. It only removed their chance to prepare. Privately, some doctors admitted defeat. One wrote that the case exceeds the reach of current understanding and advised no further intervention. A minister, older and quieter than the rest, confessed to a colleague that he feared Moses was neither blessed nor cursed, but burdened, forced to witness a truth humanity was not built to hold. He warned that pressing the boy further might break him entirely. The struggle to explain Moses revealed something uncomfortable, that both science and faith relied on boundaries, and Moses existed beyond them. Science could not measure what had no physical source. Faith could not command what did not claim allegiance. Each system required rules, and Moses' experiences followed none that anyone could see. In the end, the debates solved nothing. They only deepened the fear and isolation surrounding the boy. People stopped asking what Moses was and began asking how long it would last. Moses overheard that question once and answered it without being asked. "As long as they remember how to find me," he said. That was the moment many realized the most frightening possibility of all. Not that Moses was an anomaly, but that he was a point of contact. Not the source of the mystery, but the place where it touched the world. And no amount of medicine or prayer could close a door that no one had ever known existed. As fear replaced curiosity, the way people treated Moses, Grant changed completely. What had once been whispered fascination hardened into suspicion, and suspicion quickly turned into punishment. The boy who had never asked to be listened to became someone the community believed needed to be controlled. Adults decided that if they could not understand or silence the voices Moses described, then they could at least isolate the boy who heard them. Fear has always been faster than compassion, and Moses became its easiest target. The first punishment was distance. Moses was removed from gatherings, from shared work, from any place where people talked freely. He was told to keep quiet, to stop repeating what he heard, to act like a normal child. When he tried, the effort visibly exhausted him. Those close enough noticed he slept poorly, waking suddenly, as if called by someone only he could hear. When questioned, he stopped answering honestly, learning quickly that truth brought consequences. But silence did not protect him for long. When deaths occurred without warning, people accused him of withholding knowledge. In their minds, his silence became another crime. Isolation followed. Moses was kept apart not only physically, but emotionally. Children were warned not to play with him. Adults avoided meeting his eyes. Even those who once believed he was chosen now feared that whatever followed him might attach itself to them. He began to eat alone, work alone, exist on the edges of daily life, like a shadow people pretended not to see. Loneliness settled over him slowly, then all at once. Those who later remembered him said he grew quieter, thinner, as if part of him were fading. Punishment soon became more direct. When Moses spoke without permission, even softly, he was disciplined. Not violently, but firmly enough to teach obedience. Each time, he accepted it without protest, which unsettled people more than resistance would have. He never argued, never defended himself. He only asked once, in a small voice, whether being quiet would make the voices quieter too. No one answered him. The silence that followed was heavier than any reply. Fear turned into a kind of ritual. People began watching Moses closely, searching for signs. If he looked distracted, someone would whisper that another death was coming. If he appeared calm, they wondered who he had already heard from. Every movement became evidence, every expression a warning. Moses became less a boy and more a symbol, a living omen. He was blamed not only for deaths, but for grief itself. If someone lost a loved one suddenly, Moses' name was spoken, even if he had been nowhere nearby. The most painful isolation came from those who tried to protect him. A few believed Moses was innocent, burdened rather than dangerous. To keep him safe, they limited his interactions even further, believing fewer people meant fewer accusations. But protection felt no different from punishment. Moses was still alone. He was still unheard. He once told someone that the voices asked why people hated him for listening. "I don't call them," he said. "They come." As months passed, Moses began to withdraw inward. He spoke less, not just about the dead, but about himself. He answered questions with nods or shrugs. His eyes often seemed focused on something far away, as if part of him were already somewhere else. Those who observed him closely said he looked older than his years, worn down by a responsibility no child should carry. He stopped asking why this had happened to him. Acceptance replaced confusion, and that quiet surrender frightened people more than his words ever had. The isolation did not stop the deaths. If anything, it made them more frightening. Without warnings, people felt blind. Some began to regret pushing Moses into silence, but pride and fear kept them from admitting it. Others convinced themselves that the punishment was working, that fewer words meant fewer consequences, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The truth, that Moses was not the cause, was too unsettling to accept. Blaming him gave shape to the terror. Eventually, Moses was spoken of less and less, as if ignoring him might erase the problem entirely. He became invisible by design. When he passed through familiar spaces, conversations stopped, doors closed, eyes turned away. Yet the voices, according to the few moments he later shared, never left him. They became quieter, more distant, as if retreating alongside him. He said they sounded tired, confused by the way the living responded to truth with cruelty. The isolation reached its final form when Moses was no longer mentioned in connection with events at all. People stopped associating him with death, not because it ended, but because speaking his name felt dangerous. Silence replaced accusation, and in that silence, Moses slowly disappeared from collective memory. Not in a dramatic way, but gently, like a candle allowed to burn out unnoticed. What remains most haunting about this period is not how cruel people were, but how ordinary it all felt. No mobs, no public trials, just quiet exclusion, steady pressure, and the slow erasing of a child's place in the world. Moses was not destroyed by hatred alone, but by fear disguised as order, discipline, and reason. And in the end, the boy who was punished for speaking with the dead was made invisible by the living, leaving behind a mystery not just of voices, but of how easily humanity turns away from what it cannot understand. Moses Grant did not vanish in a way that drew attention at the time. There were no alarms, no frantic searches, no official records marking a sudden absence. His disappearance was quiet, almost polite, as if it followed the same pattern the community had already established for him: less talk, less notice, less presence. One day, people realized they hadn't seen him in a while. By then, silence had become so normal that it barely registered as something new. The last confirmed sightings of Moses were unremarkable. He was seen walking alone, as usual, moving between familiar paths with his head slightly lowered, his pace steady. Someone remembered him carrying nothing with him, no bundle, no sign of preparation. Another recalled that he looked calmer than usual, not distant or troubled, but strangely resolved. No one asked where he was going. No one stopped him. In a place where he had been watched constantly for signs of doom, his actual departure went unnoticed. When questions finally arose, they were hesitant and indirect. People asked if he had been sent away, if relatives had claimed him, if someone had decided it was safer for him to leave. No clear answer emerged. Those who might have known offered vague responses or none at all. It became easier to assume Moses had simply drifted elsewhere, as unwanted people often did. That assumption required no responsibility, no guilt, no explanation. What unsettled a few observers was that the deaths did not stop. They continued at the same unpredictable pace, untethered now from any visible warning. For some, this confirmed that Moses had never been the cause. For others, it only deepened the fear. If he was gone and the deaths remained, then whatever spoke to him might still be nearby, unseen and uncontained. Yet even that thought faded over time. People adapted. They always do. Stories about Moses began to change almost immediately. Without his presence to anchor them, details blurred. Some said he ran away. Others claimed he was taken by someone who believed in his gift. A few whispered darker possibilities, suggesting he had been silenced permanently. None of these versions could be proven. Each reflected more about the storyteller than about Moses himself. Truth, once again, slipped through the cracks. Years passed, and Moses Grant became less a person and more a story. His name surfaced in hushed conversations, usually late at night, usually after an unexpected death. Parents warned children not to speak to voices they couldn't see. Elders debated whether Moses had been cursed, chosen, or simply misunderstood. The lack of resolution allowed every theory to survive. The mystery fed on absence. What made the story endure was not just what Moses claimed to hear, but how incomplete his ending was. Human minds crave closure. They want final scenes, explanations, consequences. Moses offered none of that, He exited the narrative the same way he lived in it, quietly, unresolved, carrying something no one else could see. That unresolved quality made his story linger longer than clearer tragedies ever did. Occasionally, someone would claim to have seen a man elsewhere who reminded them of Moses. A quiet laborer who avoided crowds. A traveler who spoke little but listened intently. A figure at the edge of town who seemed older than his years. These sightings never aligned, never produced evidence, never lasted. But they kept the possibility alive that Moses had survived, grown older, carried his burden into anonymity. Whether that thought was comforting or terrifying depended on who heard it. What is most striking is how responsibility dissolved over time. No single person could be blamed for what happened to Moses, which made it easy for everyone to feel innocent. Yet, collectively, the community had shaped his fate. They isolated him, punished him, silenced him, and then allowed him to disappear without question. His mystery was not just supernatural, it was social. It showed how easily a person can be erased when they do not fit within acceptable explanations. The enduring mystery of Moses Grant is not limited to whether he truly spoke with the dead. It lies in what his story reveals about fear and denial. Faced with something that challenged understanding, people chose control over compassion, distance over curiosity. When that failed, they chose forgetting. But forgetting never fully worked. His story returned again and again, because unresolved truth has a way of resurfacing. Even today, Moses' name carries an uneasy weight. Not because there is proof of his abilities, but because there is no proof they were false. History offers no final document, no confession, no rational conclusion. Only fragments, testimonies, rumors, silences. In that space between belief and disbelief, Moses Grant still exists, suspended, listening perhaps, or finally free from the voices that once defined him. And maybe that is why his story refuses to die. Not because it promises answers, but because it exposes a question humanity still avoids. What do we do with those who experience the world in ways we cannot explain? Moses Grant disappeared, but the discomfort he left behind never truly did.